Hello and welcome. We are gathered here at the UnHerd Club in Westminster with friends and club members. Don't forget to join if you haven't already. You go to club.unherd.com to do that. Our task is to investigate an ancient philosophy that has been firmly placed in the problematic bucket. University academics are somewhat scared to study it for fear of being seen to endorse it. And it's easy to see why. It's been associated with fascists in the past, with Donald Trump's guru Steve Bannon, with far-right figures across Europe, and most prominently with Aleksandr Dugin, often referred to, perhaps inaccurately, as Putin's brain. So not exactly a list of friendly folk that you want endorsing your book. But it's about a lot more than this. It stretches back thousands of years. It contains insights as well as potential dangers. And to us, it seems to contain one of the great questions of modernity, which is how can we recover what we have lost without destroying what we love? It's worth, at the very least, understanding. It's called traditionalism, not the general sense that you like traditions or prefer traditional architecture or music. It's not conservatism. It is a fully formed philosophy, otherwise sometimes known as perennialism. And in other contexts, it might just seem like a quaint, perhaps esoteric, niche interest. But what is it? Why is traditionalism considered dangerous? Well, we are not shy of topics that others fear to dive into here at UnHerd, so we have persuaded Professor Mark Sedgwick, who is sitting right here next to me, and has written the new and definitive book on traditionalism, The Radical Project for Restoring Sacred Order, to come over from Denmark, where he teaches at Aarhus University, and explain it to us. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Great crowd of people, very much looking forward to this.
So this evening we want to cover three things. This is the crash course in traditionalism. First up, what is it and what are the central tenets? Second, how does it intersect with politics? And third, what influence has it had on the current war in Ukraine? After that, we will open up for questions and widen the discussion. I know we have some other experts on this topic in the audience who might want to join in. So, Mark.
Yes.
I want to start to give a bit of context by introducing this cast of characters that you talk about in the book. And we even have pictures of them that we can put on the screen. So, first is Rene Guenon. Who is he?
Dead.
Who was he?
He was a rather obscure French esoteric philosopher, and he tried an academic career, didn't get anywhere with that. Taught for a while in a French high school, emigrated to Egypt, became a Sufi, died there in the early 1950s, and he wrote a series of books which are not easy reading, which are the basis of the whole of this traditionalist philosophy. So he's the founding father of the whole thing.
It's worth saying that you have also been in Egypt. You've been living 20 years in Cairo.
Yes, I mean, I was living in Cairo myself when I first discovered about him.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons why I started to look at this whole phenomenon, because at that point nobody had really looked at it at all.
Okay, so Rene Guenon is the first name we need to know. Julius Evola.
Yes, rather less obscure. Italian philosopher who started off as an artist, as a Dadaist artist, and then got into various varieties of magic, and like many other Italian magicians, was very enthusiastic about the arrival of Mussolini. Was very disappointed in the end by Mussolini. In later life said that some people thought that fascism had ruined Italy, but that in his view, Italy had ruined fascism. He was briefly taken seriously by Mussolini as an advisor on race, helped form the Italian racial laws, fell out a bit with the big guys in the fascist party, ended up lecturing in Germany under the auspices of the SS in 1942 on race. which is not super cool.
Yes. Okay, so that's Julius Evola.
And then he had a second career in the 1970s as a guru of the Italian New Right in the 1970s.
Third of three, is Frithjof Schuon, if that's correctly pronounced.
Schuon, indeed, yeah. He was Swiss, sort of German-French.
Looks like quite a severe character.
Yeah, well, he had a certain image that you can see there, yeah. And he followed the Sufi bit that had started with Guenon and was a Sufi sheikh. He ran a Sufi order. And he really, in the same way that Evola really developed the political side of what Guenon had started, Schuon developed the religious, spiritual, Sufi side.
So these are the cast of characters we're going to be spending time with in the next hour.
Yes.
So let's try and understand what the real tenets of them are that you've laid out in this book. So it seems like possibly the most important, the underlying claim or insight of traditionalism is this idea of a sacred order, a kind of primordial tradition underneath the religious traditions that all of them somehow point to.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the primordial tradition, as you say, is the very basis of it. And that's where the tradition in traditionalism comes from, this idea of a primordial tradition. And there are 2 points there. One of them is the idea of a tradition, that's to say something which has been carried forward, transmitted over the centuries, over the millennia. And the other is that it's primordial and originates at the very, very, very beginning of humanity, in prehistory even. So the second idea that goes with that, as you say, is that this primordial tradition is the thing that really, really matters and survives as the internal core of the world's great religious traditions. And Guénon here used the pair of esoteric and exoteric. He didn't invent this pair, but the idea is that his primordial tradition is esoteric and central and increasingly little known, and that all the religions are exoteric and for him at least, of interest not so much in themselves, but because they are containers of this esoteric primordial tradition.
In kind of layman's terms, that means that within each of these great religious traditions, there is a sort of lesser known core. Does it tend to be the more mystical end of them? So we're talking Sufi in Islam.
We're talking Sufi in Islam.
And what would the Christian equivalent be?
I mean, that's the problem. That, as far as Guénon is concerned, Guénon, he was French. The French intellectuals tend to be rather anti-Catholic. Doesn't necessarily mean to say they're secular atheists. You can be anti-Catholic. Guénon was anti-Catholic. And his view was that Catholicism had lost its esoteric core sometime during the Middle Ages. And if we are talking other varieties of Christianity, Protestantism, being French, he wasn't terribly keen on the English either, and he said Protestantism wasn't even a religion, it was just a form of bourgeois morality. And then as far as the Orthodox are concerned, he didn't say that much about them. And this is going to be relevant when we get into your third part and Ukraine and so forth. So, yes, I mean, primarily Exhibit 1, Sufism as the esoteric heart of Islam, which is exoteric, and as he thought the form of the primordial tradition that was most accessible to Westerners. So he also found this primordial tradition in Hinduism, but thought that it was very difficult for a Westerner to retrieve the primordial tradition in that form, whereas in Islam, you just have to cross the Mediterranean like he did, and there you are.
So so far, doesn't sound very scary, I've got to say. So far, this sounds, this is the end of perennialism that we associate with the King Charles. This is a kind of general sense of, religions are all more similar than we realize, and that at their core they are speaking to the same truths, and it all sounds, frankly, quite kind of cuddly.
I mean, that bit is what is perennialism, and that bit, the idea of perennialism, cuddly as you say, has interested other people. It's interested Leibniz. It interested Huxley. So the perennial philosophy was published 50s, something like that.
Aldous Huxley.
Yeah, and it doesn't start to get challenging until you add the next element in this, which is that if what matters is the primordial tradition, which is primordial, what about modernity?
So that takes us quite nicely on to the application of this, which is, what view of history do traditionalists then espouse? Because we are taught, in roughly speaking, in the West, that there were the ancients, then there was this gloomy Dark Age period after the fall of the Roman Empire, then there was a kind of medieval period where things were beginning to look a bit better, and then bang, the Renaissance came, Enlightenment, and with it modernity, and we were kind of out of the soup, things were looking better, and we're going to the sunny uplands of today. That, I think, is fair to say, is roughly the narrative that we all have in terms of the last 2,000 years. What's the traditionalist view?
I mean, that's the narrative we all have, and this, of course, is a narrative which is very, very solidly and soundly rejected in all aspects by the traditionalists and replaced with another one. And actually, the other one is not totally unfamiliar to us in the West, because it's based on an understanding of history that was actually the mainstream one before this idea of the Dark Ages and recovery and the Renaissance and so forth got going. And that's the idea that we start with the Golden Age and we move through a Silver Age and to an Iron Age and the present. And the idea, if you look at systems of history, systems which are a rather depressing decline actually are quite common. And we have the classical one, the Roman one, starting with the Golden Age. We also have the Judeo-Christian one starting in Eden, and with the fall things get worse and worse. And instead of things getting better now, as they do in the standard medieval one you were talking about, things aren't actually going to get better in the classic Christian understanding. Things aren't going to get better until after the end of the world. And the Hindus have a similar system, and Guenon talked a lot about the Hindu system, according to which we are now living in the final last dark age, which the Hindus call the Kali Yuga. And this phrase, Kali Yuga, to describe the current age, has actually become almost a sort of code within the traditionalist movement.
If you're a diehard traditionalist, how do you view the last 2,000 years? Is it just simply descent, decline in a straight line, or?
No, I mean you've got your big decline from the primordial age. And within your big decline, you've got a sort of little decline. So as well as looking at this really big story that ends up in the Kali Yuga, the traditionalists also have a shorter periodization in which the Middle Ages and the Renaissance feature. And they just feature the other way around. The Middle Ages are the good period, and the Renaissance is where things finally all go completely wrong. So
what do they like about the medieval, the pre-modern period that they don't like about the Enlightenment?
The pre-modern period, they think, was still familiar with the primordial tradition. So when you asked about the Christian context, we have the scholastic philosophers in the Christian context, and Guenon wasn't 100% sure, but he thought that they probably still had access to this primordial tradition. And then with the Renaissance, and God help us, the Enlightenment, we have the so-called, the reign of so-called reason, which, as far as these guys are concerned, is the negation of the tradition, because the question, where does an idea or an understanding come from? Does it come from the tradition, in which case we should take it seriously, or was it just made up by some guy 50 years ago, in which case we can't take it seriously?
So they view a kind of the medieval or even the Dark Ages as somehow they may not have the material benefits of today, but people were closer connected to some kind of sacred order.
Exactly. So the last time that we had anything that these guys would approve of as the proper sacred order was precisely in the medieval period.
And then Enlightenment, tell us about that. If you're a traditionalist, the Enlightenment is just the big bad.
The Enlightenment is complete delusion, because the Enlightenment is the idea that today's rather reduced human beings can replace with their own feeble minds the true primordial tradition. And it just gets worse, because Enlightenment leads to various other characteristics of modernity. For example, the idea of equality, democracy, progress, things like that.
Well, let's just spend a little moment on each of those, because they sound kind of important.
Yes.
So this is anti-progressive in the most literal and true sense.
Yeah.
So where a progressive believes that, roughly speaking, the world is getting better and that all of our innovations and efforts are making the world a better place, your traditionalist believes the exact opposite.
Indeed, that the idea of progress is one of the most dangerous illusions that we find in modernity.
So it sounds very bleak.
Yes.
If you're living inside this tradition, where are you getting your goal from? What you're trying to reconnect then, rather than invent something.
Well, I mean, this is the point where the traditionalists begin to disagree with each other, because what we've covered so far, the fundamental analysis, the fundamental structure, the relationship between tradition and modernity, and so forth, that is common to everybody in this movement in one form or another. When we get to, so what do we do now? They have very different responses. And Evola, for example, following on the bleakness, said, well, one thing that one can do under these circumstances is retire to a nice house somewhere up a mountain and sit there and wait for things to get even worse. But
that's
not
the ascetic response.
Well, ascetic, yes. I mean, it didn't have to be ascetic, and I think he might have been thinking about this himself at one point, because he said that not everybody has the sort of spiritual strength for that sort of thing, and that's the asceticism. But he also said that not everybody has enough money for that sort of thing. So perhaps his vision of this house up the mountain that he was rejecting required quite a nice house. But no, so then there is also the ascetic, and he spent more time on the ascetic, because the approach there is we can't do anything much about the world, but we can still separate ourselves from all these awful things through an ascetic approach to life.
And since we're on Evola, I mean, he was anti-Semitic. Yes. I mean, what should we conclude about that? He was closely involved with the fascists and the kind of racial ideas around that. he hated bankers. He thought the kind of commodification of everything was wicked, and he put a lot of that on the Jews. Is that what?
Well, I mean, yes and no. He was. I mean, he certainly wasn't pro-Semitic at all, but he actually tried to nuance the Nazi understanding of race. So one of his major books on race was actually a critique of Nazi racism. And astonishingly, the Nazis allowed this to be published in German translation. But what he said there was that the Nazi purely biological understanding of race was perhaps suitable if you were trying to breed dogs or racehorses. But if you were dealing with human beings, the human being was much more complicated than that. So he did not actually, he didn't sign up to the Nazi understanding of race, and in some ways argued against it, which is actually what got Mussolini interested, because Mussolini didn't want just to follow the Nazi understanding.
Okay, I think we are going to come back to that, but I want to move on because I want to hit all of the kind of central tenets here. Self-realization. We were talking about what do you do if you're a traditionalist. So you believe that the world is getting worse. You believe we're getting further and further from the sacred tradition. One thing you can try and do is to self-realize. What does that mean?
Well, this is, I mean, this here we're going back to the sort of cuddly form, somewhat, because for Guénon, that was the point. That's what one does, and the path to self-realization for Guénon is by rediscovering what one can of the primordial tradition and then following that. So in his own case, the path to self-realization lay through Sufism, and this is actually what most people who are perennialists think. I mean, the standard cuddly version of perennialism points to religious paths and mystical paths to self-realization. So that's fine so far as Guénon is concerned. And Schuon basically followed the same understanding. But with Evola, it gets a bit more complicated because he didn't like this Sufi idea, partly because he was a believer in the heritage of Roman imperialism and so forth, and the idea of people running off and learning Arabic and becoming Muslims didn't really appeal to him. So he explored a number of different paths to self-realization. Some of them were a bit like Guénon's Tantra, for example, but some of them were more Nietzschean, the idea of becoming the absolute individual. And he talked here about the path of the aesthetic path and also the path of the warrior. And the path of the warrior, I mean, obviously this fits quite well with a lot of the ideas that were around in the fascist period and the Nazi period. But the path of the warrior is also something which interested him and some of his followers in the 1970s. And this is very much the individual warrior, not the soldier in an army, but the individual warrior. And in some cases in the 1970s, this is where it got extremely uncuddly, because there was a terrorist group which was sort of seeing themselves as the path,
so
path of the warrior.
This is so-called the path of action, or the path of the warrior. Yeah. I've got a quote. The follower of the path of action evokes in himself the transcendent power of destruction. He takes it on, becomes transfigured in it and free, thus breaking loose from all human bonds.
Yes.
So it's basically jihad.
It can be. I mean, he wasn't very keen on Europeans becoming Muslim, but one of the things he liked about Islam was jihad, indeed.
So just try and explain that, because I mean, it just sounds terrifying, really. But so the idea is that in some way you kind of rediscover a more vital is it akin to the kind of heroic ages, Nietzschean Übermensch, and what is it?
Yeah, it is indeed. But it's also because if you think about it, the ascetic path of the monk and the path of the warrior actually have something in common. Why on earth should somebody get up at 4 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter and consider not their own comfort, but the interests of other people? It might be a monk, or it might be a warrior going out on guard duty. So, I mean, both trainings actually have this common element of disciplining oneself for the sake of others or an other. I mean, in the case of the monk, the other is probably the transcendent God, something like that. And for the warrior, it's whatever group the warrior is meant to be fighting for.
I mean, this really does start feeling resonant of some kind of current alt-right, far-right talking points. Yeah. You see it on Twitter, you see it all over the place, which is it's about heroic ideas of masculinity, rediscovering a kind of heroic, virile, Nietzschean form of manly existence.
And this was very important for Evola. I mean, Evola was interested he was a man, and he was interested primarily in paths that a man could follow. And he also talked a little bit about paths of self-sacrifice that a woman might follow. And here he identified, didn't go into that much detail, but he identified the path of the mother and the path of the lover as two forms of self-sacrifice that he thought were appropriate for females. But this wasn't, it sounds a bit like old-fashioned sexism, but it was more than that. I mean, of course, he was a sexist, but it was more than that, because he understood the male and the female as divine principles, even. So each had their own appropriate ways, paths.
This takes us quite neatly onto the political aspect in a way, because when you start to consider how these ideas relate to how we should organize ourselves as a society, or what a good life looks like for a community, it all gets, certainly from the modern perspective, a little bit more scary. In the book, you talk about how our contemporary minds, what we're taught in political theory, is that the important things are sovereignty, freedom, perhaps a form of welfare. This is how we measure a well-functioning, good society, whilst in the pre-modern view of the world, which was espoused by these guys, it's all about order, isn't it?
It's about order, but it's also about the possibilities for self-realization. It tends to come back to self-realization. And it depends who you are. I mean, they all envisaged a very stratified social system, which Guenon took from the Hindu caste system and then sort of mixed together with the pre-revolutionary French system of estates. So in the proper society...
Caste means it's hierarchical. So
caste certainly means hierarchical.
There's an elite, and then there are kind of layers. They want people to be fixed in a particular position.
But people have particular functions, right? So the starting point for these guys is the functions. So at the top, you have your sacred caste, priests, scholars, and they all tended to locate themselves in that top Brahmin type caste. And then you pass your way down from the guys, the thinkers, the people who know the primordial tradition, who are the ones who really should be in charge of everything. Then you pass down to the military caste, the nobility in the old French system. Here Guénon and Evola have a slight disagreement, because Guénon, who was the thinker, wants thinkers and then warriors, but Evola, who's, as we've seen, fancies himself as a bit of a warrior and had actually fought in the First World War. He wants to combine these two a bit, and then after that, you then get your merchant caste, and at the bottom you get your peasants. And a peasant who is a proper peasant is superior to a noble who isn't a proper noble. So it's not. I mean, it's very hierarchical. It's completely hierarchical, absolutely, but it's also about function. So Evola, for example, was extremely critical of the so-called nobility of his own day for spending more time with cocktail shakers than with swords.
So they weren't proper members of their caste because they weren't living that role correctly.
They weren't warriors.
I mean, it's almost funny to hear your description of it, because it's just so alien to how we think of the world. And yet, I suppose, throughout most of human history, up until recent centuries, that is how societies have generally been organized.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you do a sort of comparative history of social theory, going back 500 years and looking at different human societies, at the Ottomans, at the Japanese, at the Indians, some form of this hierarchical structure and differentiation by function as well. So, I mean, it's
Plato as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's not. As with many things, the traditionalists aren't making this up on the basis of nothing. I mean, these are very standard ideas that they are finding, and in a sense, I mean, they say they're recovering the primordial tradition.
So what is there? If they're not here to answer this question, so you've spent more time in reading their books than
none of them.
We haven't got them in the room, but a modern person would ask one of these guys, that all sounds very nice to have a fixed hierarchy and everyone enjoying their respective roles and flourishing and the rest of it. But what if you don't like the caste you're in? Most people find that the whole concept of that fixed hierarchy, everything we despise, because it means that there is no equality, there is no possibility for people to transcend their position, and it sort of renders your whole life much smaller. And that's what we're so proud of as moderns. Yeah. What would they say in return?
They don't go into great detail about this, but the answer would be that if you don't like the caste you're in, there are two possibilities. One of them is that you genuinely should be in a different caste. So off you go. I suppose if you regard yourself as an intellectual, that puts you in the top caste, which is great. But if you want to be a warrior, off you go and be a warrior. And that's fine. The other possibility is if you don't like the caste you're in, it's because you're not doing that properly. So you're not a fully peasanty peasant, and if you become a more peasanty peasant,
you'll start to enjoy it.
You'll start to enjoy it. Whereas if that's the problem, and you're no good at being a peasant, to try and become a trader, that's not going to work either. So you go and be a proper peasant, if that's the problem.
There's a quote that you have in your book from Guénon where he describes the good society. And he says, all things in every order of existence are connected and correspond to one another so as to contribute to universal and total harmony.
Yes.
So I guess they would argue that there's a sort of harmony to living in an ordered, structured, hierarchical society, that in the modern era with greater turbulence and
you've
sort of lost. Is that what they would say?
Absolutely. And this then gets to the question of how we relate to nature, for example, as well, and the harmony between humans and nature. But if we go back once again to the primordial idea, in their understanding, and actually many other people's understanding of the primordial idea, everything is connected, everything is planned by God or whoever we think is planning it. Nothing happens by chance, nothing is random. So there is a possibility of a proper order, not just a social order like the one we've been talking about, but, as I said, an order between humans and nature, an order between man and woman, father and child, and also an order, and this is what is the central idea, an order in the development of the human spirit, and an order in relations between the human spirit and the transcendent. So,
what it reminds me of, to bring it back to the current day, is one thing certainly is the integralists in the US. There is a growing and actually pretty influential group on the right in the US that many of them are Catholics, and they are pushing for a more integral order, basically where government is infused with the moral goods that it gets from its religious teaching, and basically everyone walks around not having a private sense of what is good, but there's a single, universally agreed on public sense of what is virtuous, and it's enforced pretty much by the state. I think that's a reasonably fair description of it. They are getting some traction. It's fringe, but they are. Do you think there's a comparison there?
It's fringe nowadays, right? But these ideas once were not that fringe. For certain civilizations in certain periods, these ideas were not fringe at all. They were absolutely central. So it's in some ways it's not surprising that they are getting some sort of traction. And the ideas you just described are not exactly the same as the traditionalists, but they fit together. And that is actually, I think, one of the reasons why traditionalism nowadays is having the political impact it is having, because it fits. You don't have to be a card-carrying traditionalist. You can just read these guys, think about it, think, yes, that makes some sort of sense. And their perspectives fit together with other perspectives like that one. So there's a sort of mutual reinforcement going on there.
Another society there's a lot of them in today's world are Islamic societies, Sharia law, countries and communities where basically the religious order is much closer to the government.
Yeah.
Are there these places that traditionalists would argue are closer to a good society than the Western one?
Absolutely. Especially for Guenon, who, remember, he went and moved to Cairo, lived there, became a Sufi and so forth. And the idea of the Sharia as the external law that structures society was absolutely right. That was part of his model of how things should be. Of course, he found in the Egypt of the 1930s and the 1940s that the Sharia wasn't actually structuring things. And he said, okay, so these Muslim societies have also been infected by this modernity problem. But a medieval society structured by the divine law is absolutely his ideal. Now, as a historian who's worked on those periods, it wasn't quite like that. But for them, for Guenon, these guys, it was the ideal. Yes, absolutely.
And if we're just completing our little global tour here, we have to mention China. I think you talk a bit about Confucius and Confucianism in this book. Modern China in 2023, would you say that is closer than the West to a kind of traditionalist society in any way. I mean, certainly values of freedom are less celebrated. There is a greater sense of, I don't know, an imposed order, a communitarian communist.
Yes, I mean certainly. Certainly, Guénon saw the Confucian order as the equivalent of the Sharia-based order, and certainly there's been a lot of interesting talk recently about neo-Confucianism. And
what's that?
When people are talking about neo-Confucianism, they are understanding what we have in China at present as closer in some ways to the Confucian system than to anything that Marx and Lenin dreamt up. And all right, I mean, I have less authority to talk about this, but I myself, I think that's quite convincing, and I think it's also very interesting how the Chinese model is beginning to emerge as an alternative model to Western democracies. And coming back to the region that I know a bit better, the Middle East, we have in the United Arab Emirates a system which has something in common with the Chinese system, and which some people are beginning to argue might be becoming an alternative model for other countries to follow.
I mean, what is so, I think it's provocative, but it's worth thinking about, is that we think these ideas are so alien and eccentric and frankly outrageous. Sitting here in Westminster. But even if you look at the population of the world right now, the Muslim part of the world, many people have feelings that are closer to this than we would recognize. China, we've just talked about. Actually, in a way, it's the West that is the anomaly. It's the contemporary West that is the odd one out in this.
Well, I think it is. I mean, modernity, there's a big discussion about what is modernity, of course, but I mean, modernity was in most understandings a Western invention without precedent in human history. And we think sometimes that this has become some sort of a global norm. And in some ways, certain aspects of it have, at least superficially. But when you look beneath the surface, outside Westminster, you find that actually what's going on beneath the surface is sometimes quite different from this sort of official Western global modernity.
Let's move to what I promised would be the third part of our conversation, which is to look at how, right now, some of these ideas are being applied, you could argue, or are influencing politics very directly, and that we have war on our continent. Russia has invaded Ukraine, and we know that Aleksandr Dugin achieved, maybe he didn't become Putin's brain exactly, but his ideas about a Eurasian power bloc were certainly influential in the Russian ideas of what their sort of foreign policy should be.
I think that puts it quite nicely, because Dugin is not Putin's brain. They're not even close to each other. I mean, they know of each other's existence, obviously, but Putin has a brain of his own, and he has a circle of advisors and cronies and people like that. And Dugin is not part of that circle.
But we got a picture of him behind us. He exerts influence. He has large numbers of followers, and he has this slight sort of forbidden guru status.
He's a public intellectual. In some ways, at one point, he was the Russian equivalent of Samuel Huntington. So we have Samuel Huntington's celebrated book on the clash of civilizations, and we have Aleksandr Dugin's equally celebrated book on geopolitics.
Now, you've met Aleksandr Dugin a few times.
Yes.
What's he like?
He's an intellectual. It's funny. I mean, he's an intellectual, and sitting talking to him like we're talking. I mean, we could add him to this conversation.
That would get some tongues wagging.
It would.
If you're watching, Mr. Dugin, I'm not sure I'm going to extend an invitation right now, but
no, but I mean, he'd actually enjoy being part of this conversation until you said the wrong thing. I mean, there was a famous BBC interview when the BBC interviewer said the wrong thing and got thrown out halfway through the interview. So, there is another side to him. I mean, he's as well as being an intellectual, he has been a television commentator as well as being a public intellectual. He can speak effectively to a mass audience, and currently he is probably the most outspoken voice in Russia in favor of the current war, in favor of understanding the current war as an absolute and final conflict. So, I mean, the Russians grew up with stories of the Great Patriotic War and the Nazis and so forth.
So let's try and understand what his rationale might be for some of this. I mean, he actually published an essay earlier this month, in which he called for total mobilization. And I'm going to read a quote from it because it really reminds me of the Evola quote we just read. He said, "When death is before us and we don't run away from it and we don't turn our backs on it, that's when we exist authentically. In a sense, this can be described both as a total mobilization on an existential level and as what I would call an awakening." So there's this, It does sound like that kind of path of action, Nietzschean something or other. There's some sense of living more vitally coming from some kind of apocalyptic battle.
Yeah.
He's running, what is he running towards? Some kind of disaster?
Well, he is running towards an apocalypse, because if you, and of course the reason why the bit you just read out sounds like Evola is it's very much inspired by Evola, because Dugin is very much inspired by Evola. He was very, very inspired by him. And he's added other influences since then, but he's still absolutely faithful, I think, to his original identification with Evola.
So why does he want an apocalypse?
He doesn't want an apocalypse.
Did he not describe himself to you?
He's an apocalyptic, yes, absolutely right.
Tell us that
absolutely.
story.
Well, I mean, this is something he actually says. I mean, there was one point in his career when he was getting quite sort of respectable, and he went on a visit to the US and was set up by the State Department to have a chat with Brzezinski. And I was talking to him about this and said something which caused him to say, "Thank you very much," which caused him to respond, "Mark, you are forgetting that I am an apocalyptic." But it's not so much.
What does that mean?
Well, fine. This is what it means. We have to go back to the very original traditionalist understanding of time and the Kali Yuga. How does the Kali Yuga end? It ends in the apocalypse. So for all these traditionalists, the next thing that's going to happen is the apocalypse. And at least in theory, the next thing that happens after the apocalypse is that the grand cycle of time starts again with a new golden age, and the primordial tradition reigns supreme. So there is at least a theoretical welcoming of the apocalypse as the start of the new age.
So this is just so I understand it.
Yeah.
The idea is that we've come so far from the sacred order, we've descended so deep that there's no way of remedying it, and that the only solution is to burn it all down and hope that it rises again, starts again. That's their
to burn it
idea.
all down in the expectation of it all rising again, in the confident expectation of it all rising again. I mean,
I would say this is very terrifying, I think, because if it's true that he has any influence on the Russian
it is, yeah.
government,
Yeah.
and we are facing a conflict that could, in theory, become a nuclear one, to have the idea of apocalypse romanticized is very frightening.
Yes. I mean, indeed. And I mean, you know, it's with Dugin, we've been moving towards this. I mean, I remember after 9/11, he published an essay which had the title of "The Twin Swallows of the Apocalypse." I mean, he thought that 9/11 was going to lead to the apocalypse, and it didn't really. It just sort of went a bit in that direction. But no, I mean, he's very often when people talk about the apocalypse or nuclear war or total extinction or something like that, they don't really mean it. He does, absolutely. And
do you think there are others in the kind of Russian sphere that think like that? How far do you think it's traveled?
Well, I mean, you know, Russia has always been a society in which religious messianic expectations, narratives have been able to gain traction, more so than in this society, for example. So, I mean, yes, I think certainly there are people who are in agreement with him, confidently expecting a nuclear apocalypse. I just hope, you know, I have no idea what the commander of the strategic missile forces. I don't even know who he is. I just hope that he isn't sitting up at night reading Dugin's latest essay.
Let's end by, if we haven't got into trouble enough already,
yes.
Let's just complicate matters further, because in fact, these ideas are not only influencing the Russian side of this conflict, they have also influenced some parts of the Ukrainian side. Certainly the Azov battalion, which is a far-right armed battalion that is an official part of the Ukrainian armed forces at this point.
Yes.
And once again, you've met these people. They're kind of intellectual heroine.
Yes.
Semeniaka.
Yes.
Olena Semeniaka.
Yes.
Who is the kind of celebrity of the Azov movement. You have interviewed. Tell us about her.
Well, I mean, she's a clever young woman who, when I've met her, was doing a PhD in political science, which I believe she's now completed, and she is the intellectual inspiration of that part of this movement. I mean, she denies this. She may at some point have been a fan of Dugin's, but you know, nowadays
there are photographs of them together.
Yes, but she wants to lose that part of her history for obvious reasons. But she represents a somewhat broader version. I mean, they have their leading author at present is Junger. So the
Ernst Junger.
Yeah, Ernst Junger with his War Steel. Storm of Steel, exactly. But the traditionalists fit into that. I mean, obviously not Dugin, but I mean, Evola fits in very much to their understanding. So what we have is an intellectual, and incidentally, it's quite interesting that although in theory, you know, men and women have their entirely different functions, etc., that the leading intellectual in the Ukraine is a woman, and there was actually a sort of Russian equivalent of her at one point. But anyhow, we have the intellectual center, and then we have indeed the Azov battalion, and which started off, I mean, ironically, it was a bit like Prigozhin's outfit, but the Ukrainians seem to have integrated it into their armed forces rather more effectively than the
So there are
Russians.
components on the Ukrainian side who have also, their kind of intellectual heritage reaches back to the same pool of thinkers via Dugin.
Yeah.
And so on both sides.
Via authors who Dugin has promoted, via authors who Dugin probably introduced first into the Russian reading Ukrainian sphere. So Jung, so Evola, yeah. So not Dugin directly nowadays. I mean, obviously nobody there is reading Dugin, or at least admitting to reading Dugin. I'm sure they're reading him out of interest.
Do you think that means that our sense that Ukraine is going to kind of become part of a Western order in an uncomplicated way might be misplaced?
I think it's a bit oversimplified. I mean, when after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had the idea that countries like Poland and Hungary were going to happily become part of the old EU sphere in an uncomplicated way, and it didn't happen because they have their own histories. Their experience of the 20th century is very different from the West European experience of the 20th century. So, I mean, obviously, in some ways they did. I mean, they're valued members of the European Union and so forth. But some people were a little surprised by the directions that they then went off in. And I mean, Ukraine has an even more different experience of the 20th century.
But what about the Christian, in the broader sense? It seems opposite to Christianity. How can it be that most of the current traditionalists, whether they are on the far right in Europe or in America or indeed in Russia, are Christians?
Yes.
And yet they are signing up to writers who are all about throwing off the Enlightenment, throwing off and basically reaching a kind of ancient or a pre-modern, possibly pre-Christian worldview and ethic. I mean, how do they justify?
Yes. I mean, for Evola, it's very explicitly pre-Christian. For Guenon, it is pre-Christian, but the emphasis isn't there so much. I mean, if we take Dugin, for example, who is probably the major Christian figure within this. He started off at the beginning of his career trying to solve the problem of how do I fit this together with Christianity? Because in the case of Evola, clearly didn't fit together with Christianity, and in the case of Guenon, it didn't really fit comfortably with Christianity because
how did he do it?
He said orthodoxy is different. He said, fine, Protestantism, sure, like Guenon said, not even a religion. Catholicism, just like Guenon said, lost anything of value. Orthodoxy, however, still represents the tradition. And then that quite importantly fits together with his geopolitics, because he sets up this system, he sets up two piles of Russian dolls, to use your expression there. So Eurasia contains Russia, and Russia contains orthodoxy, and orthodoxy contains tradition, all that is good. And then on the other side, the Atlantic world contains the United States, and the United States contains modernity, and modernity excludes tradition, all that is evil.
So the line between, as Dugin sees it, between the East and West, between the good bit and the bad bit, is roughly where the Orthodox Church ends.
Absolutely. And this fits together with the old Russian idea of Moscow as the third Rome. So the successor of the center of the Christian faith. But his sacred geography has Russia and Orthodoxy as the living representatives of tradition.
So that's the heart of the Eurasian bloc.
Yes.
And then all of us lot in Western Europe are satellites of the American Atlanticist world, which is the enemy.
England, has an Atlantic coast. So it's very much part of the Atlantic world, and he's building on ideas here about geopolitics and from an earlier period. Germany, is it really Atlantic or is it potentially Eurasian?
So you think Dugin would like to see parts of Germany in the Russian?
Yes.
Another terrifying thought.
With all these thinkers, do they actually have any real political plan as to what they actually want to do or really achieve? Do they more see themselves as intellectuals analysing the world, or do they really want to change the world?
They're intellectuals analysing the world who want to change the world by changing the way that we think about the world. And in this, they are similar to the thinkers of the French New Right and of the New Right in general, with whom they're often on quite good terms.
Eric Zemmour, for example.
Well, I'm thinking here of Benoit and Guillaume Fay and people like that, who have this idea of what they call metapolitics. And this is an idea that they take from Gramsci, of all people. And it's the idea that in order to change the way that we do things, you have to change the way that we think about things. And I mean, this in some ways is the reversal of the classic Marxist position that the realities of power determine intellectual life, and which I personally find rather more sympathetic than that idea, that the idea that the way that we think about things and understand things is fundamental to what we then do. So, behind, I'm getting into Russian dolls again here, I think we need some other metaphor. Behind political action, you have political thought, and behind political thought, you have philosophical thought.
And is it connected to the hierarchy then? Because if you persuade the top elite class, the sacred class, then the warriors and everyone else will follow. Is that what they're thinking?
Yes, I mean, certainly for Guénon, his objective was to reconstitute a sort of right-thinking priestly class or caste or whatever. And he spoke a lot about the intellectual elite. Now, one of the reasons why Guénon is difficult to read is that he uses words in a completely different sense from the words they normally have. And for him, intellectual doesn't mean intellectual in the way that it means for us. It means spiritual. So Guénon's project was the reconstitution of a spiritual elite, which could then, he hoped, lead the transformation of thought, which could lead the transformation of other things. Or perhaps not, because the world might end first.
Which might be preferable, or at least the apocalypse.
Well, it might be preferable. But then also, there might be some need for a sort of transfer period from this world as it ends to the new world as it starts, in which case his spiritual elite, which worked out to be, the group of sympathetic authors who wrote articles in the magazine that he edited and that we've been talking about, really.
Could you talk a bit more about how traditionalism lands in Steve Bannon's influence in Latin America? Yes.
I mean,
have you met him as well?
I haven't met him.
Okay.
I haven't met him.
Corresponded. I'm a journalist. I've got to answer this.
He once sent me an email. We didn't get further than that. But there is another scholar who I know who's also published by Penguin, who spent a lot of time with him and got a lot of interviews with him, and who I work with sometimes. So
is he a traditionalist?
Bannon. Well, I mean, he says that discovering Guénon was a turning point in his life. He doesn't say that it was the final turning point in his life, which clearly it wasn't. And he has, as this guy, Benjamin Teitelbaum, who might be listening to this, hi Benjamin, as he told Benjamin, he accepts certain parts of the traditionalist narrative, especially the critique of modernity, and he rejects certain other parts. So, for example, he is not a perennialist.
Well, he's a very believing Catholic.
He is a believing Catholic.
He's trying to start a kind of ultra-conservative university.
Exactly. So at this point, Guénon will jump up and say, look, you've got it wrong. You can't build anything on contemporary Catholicism because it has lost the essence of the whole thing. But it
sort of actually is a really interesting example because Steve Bannon, for anyone who doesn't know, is Donald Trump's kind of intellectual guru, insofar as he could have one.
Trump's brain, we might say.
Trump's brain, you might say. And it is quite hard to think of any political project which looks less like restoring sacred order than the Donald Trump experience.
But
that's traditionalism.
Yeah, but before you can build, you have to destroy.
Right.
You have to knock down the existing structures.
So that's what you think Bannon thought of Trump as a sort of
I think
wrecking
so.
ball?
I think so. I think Trump was a wrecking ball.
The Steve Bannon to Trump process, the Rene Guenon to Steve Bannon to Donald Trump journey.
We've got the red thread, the common line here is the critique of modernity. Right. Trump was not going to become a Sufi, and neither was Bannon. Neither was Bannon. But what informs the whole of this is the very, very fundamental critique of modernity.
And which is also why this is a dangerous discipline, because what happens is anyone who basically doesn't like the modern world in some way, this provides some kind of apparent intellectual ballast to. And it can be seized on by all sorts of people with all sorts of crazy ideas.
Yeah. I mean, if you go around the place knocking things down, as Trump was, I think, trying to, you don't necessarily know what's going to replace them. And I do not share the faith that somehow the primordial tradition is going to sort of order everything up if we manage to destroy things enough.
I'm going to abuse my chair and ask one final question, and then we will draw this to a conclusion. You write and talk in this very neutral way.
Yes.
Sort of carefully scientific about these ideas. Are you a traditionalist?
I'm not. I mean, I have been mistaken for one. I have to admit that at some points in my life, I've found these ideas rather attractive. I don't think I could have worked on them as I have done if there hadn't been something there. But it's, in some ways, it's the fate of the scholar to discover too much about what goes on behind the scenes to be convinced by what we're seeing on the stage.
So how should we think of it, do you think? Because I think everyone listening to this, there will be some corner of it that appeals.
Well,
probably.
exactly.
And yet, obviously, in the real world, the practical applications of it, as have been attempted, have almost all been disastrous. So, if you do feel that tug of modernity has lost something fundamental, maybe we need to live in a more ordered way, maybe we've got things wrong and we need to put it right in some fundamental way, which I suspect most even people probably feel. How should we view traditionalism? Is it just a red herring? Is it a false hope?
No, it isn't a red herring. It's a very interesting and often quite convincing critique, what I would advise people to do is to take what they can get out of that critique and not sign up for the whole narrative. I mean, there's more than one narrative.
Don't
to sign
get a
up.
Kalashnikov and go and join Dugin in the Donbass.
There are some Ukrainians who will welcome you at this point as well. And probably if you have a British passport, you'd be better off with the Ukrainians than with the Russians.
I'm not planning to join either faction, I can assure you.
I'm not recommending.
Professor Mark Sedgwick, thank you so much.
Thank you.